We're going to go on a little walk today. And apparently today, I didn't know this, but it is the shortest, it is the day with the least amount of sunlight in 2019. Welcome to day 26 of the J137 vlog, and today we're looking at Genesis 43 through 45. In chapter 43, we see that Jacob wants to send his sons back to Egypt to get more grain and more food during the famine, but his sons tell him that they can't go back without Benjamin. That was the Egyptian official's instructions, who is aka Joseph. Jacob then asks his son, "Why did you tell this official about your brother?" In order for them to get food, Benjamin has to come with them regardless. So Jacob has this smart idea of getting a lot of these really nice gifts that they can take with them to Egypt, to this official, once again, aka Joseph, to try to appease him. As they're coming, Joseph sees them and tells his steward of his house to greet them, to bring them in, to prepare a meal and a feast for them. And his brothers are surprised. They think that actually the steward bringing them into Joseph's house, that is a ploy for Joseph to take all the stuff that they have, all their donkeys that they've been traveling with, so that they would be left with nothing. But really what we see here is that there's this great awesome meeting and this feast. They party, they have a good time, and Joseph, he's excited to see them and he's excited to be with them. Joseph asks them about how their dad is doing. He has conversation with them, and then they have this feast. But because his brothers are Hebrew and there are Egyptians there, they separate when they eat. But there seems to be this kind of party. They kind of getting along with each other here in chapter 43. Then in chapter 44 comes the test. What Joseph tells his servant to do is to take one of Joseph's silver cups, which apparently he uses this for divination. This is mentioned twice in this chapter. I'm not going to get into that right now, but it is interesting that he talks about this particular silver cup he uses for the purposes of divination. They put this silver cup in Benjamin's bag, or his sack, as Benjamin and all his brothers are heading back to the land of Canaan with this new grain, new money, all this stuff that they've attained since they've been in Egypt. And what happens is the servant or the steward catches up to Joseph's brothers and accuses them of this thing where they have stolen the silver cup of his master. And the brothers say, "If you find this silver cup, whoever bag you find this silver cup in, you can kill that person." Because of this offense, at least it appears to be an offense from the brothers' perspective, what Joseph says is, because Benjamin has done this thing, he is to remain in my house as my servant. But then Judah pipes up, and Judah basically says that this cannot happen, that our father back home, he will just be completely distraught if he learns of anything awful happening to his youngest son, Benjamin. And at the end of the chapter, we see Judah basically offering himself in place of Benjamin so that his father Jacob would not be this just depressed and sad about losing Benjamin. It's, Judah has come a long way. I'm proud of Judah. Then in chapter 45, this is where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. What happens is Joseph starts weeping and crying, and this time he tells everyone to leave except for his brothers. And when everyone leaves, he then reveals to his brothers that he is indeed Joseph. And at first they're like, no way, he's dead. Like, we sold him into slavery. And then they came closer and looked at him, and sure enough, they realized it was Joseph. And then he gives them a little discourse and really encourages his brother and says, hey, I know you guys did this awful thing to me years ago, but I want you to know that God used this to essentially save our people. Then there's this weeping and this just crying with one another and talking to each other. Obviously, they got a lot of catching up to do. Then Pharaoh got word of this, and Pharaoh found favor with all of this and basically told Joseph, hey, get your dad and your family and bring them to the land of Goshen, where they can be under our care, so that we can make sure during this famine that your family, they're not just well taken care of, but they get some of the best stuff that we have to offer in the midst of this famine. And they go back to their father Jacob, and they tell Jacob the report, and Jacob's like, let's go, I want to see my son before I die. There are two things in these chapters that I thought was very intriguing. And the first thing is what we see in chapter 44 of how we see Judah respond to the test that Joseph puts his brothers through when he puts the silver cup in Benjamin's bag. Judah was willing to lay down his life for his younger brother Benjamin, all for the sake that he might please his father Jacob. And we see this picture of Christ in that. That Christ himself, from the tribe of Judah, which is cool, that he would lay down his life so that everyone who would put faith and belief in him would be saved. And Jesus did this, yes, because he wants to save us and he wants relationship with you and I, but he does this because he did that because he loves his Father and he wanted to please his Father. And we see this in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus has this struggle of, man, Lord, I'm really nervous about what's coming, but you are my dad, and I want to please you. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And so it's a beautiful picture of Christ that we see in that chapter. The second thing is simply Joseph's perspective of God. I want to read to you really quickly the verses in which we find Joseph just having this amazing perspective of God. And this is in chapter 45, verse 5 through 8. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord over all his house, and ruler over the land of Egypt. This is crazy. Joseph sees his brothers trying to kill him and then eventually selling him into slavery, as well as being in prison, as God sending him. But the idea here, and once again we go back to Genesis 50 verse 20, is that what man has intended for evil, God is using for good. His brothers selling him into slavery, him being thrown into prison, these are bad, evil things that had happened to Joseph, yet God is using them for a greater good that is ultimately saving people. But I'm so encouraged as well as convicted by how big of a view Joseph has of God. That Joseph, he is perfectly fine with saying, hey, when I was sold into slavery and when I was in prison, God was sending me to those things because God has a greater purpose. And I think if we can submit ourselves to God in that way and realize that it's not about how much we can control and how much we can be in power while we're here on this earth, but rather it's about acknowledging God's power, acknowledging that God is in control, acknowledging that He knows everything, and while we might be in really difficult situations in life, that He has a purpose in it, and we need to trust that purpose.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was it. Thank you for watching. My name is...
This is the book of Exodus.
So that's just a little bit of footage of when Christian Beh happens to get a handle on my camera.